Good afternoon, everybody. Bon après-midi, tout le monde. My name is Neil Bauer. I am a Vice President here at the Canada School of Public Service. It's a pleasure to welcome you all here today. We have a packed room here at the De La Salle Academy. It might have helped that we marketed this as a Jurassic Park De La Salle. So, but if you're thinking you're going to see the Raptors game here, you may be disappointed. Thanks as well to those of you who are joining online. We have a nice-sized online audience for this event, so we thank you very much for tuning in to what is going to be, I hope, a really interesting discussion. So the title of today's event is Mitigating Misinformation. So you may be wondering about the potential for social media to impact on society or on our political sphere. That might be one reason why you're here. You might actually be concerned of potential threats that these platforms become sources of misinformation or used. You may even be concerned that there are malicious players out there who are in a concerted way trying to basically undertake a campaign of misinformation. And you may be tuning in because you'd like to know what we can do about it as citizens, as communities, as departments and agencies of government, as public services in Canada and around the world. And those are great reasons to be here. So we're really pleased today to have a fantastic panel here to kind of talk through some of these issues. First of all, we have Sasha Havlicek, who is the founder and Chief Executive Officer of the Institute for Strategic Dialogue. We have Ed Greenspan, the President and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. We have Adam Fisher, who's a Director General at the Intelligence Assessment Branch of CSIS. And we have Owen Ripley, who's a DG Broadcasting, Copyright and Creative Marketplace Branch at the Department of Canadian Heritage, and he'll explain why, what a DG of copyright is doing in a place like this as we go through. So first of all, I think in terms of distance traveled, Sasha, you have the prize for coming the longest distance to come. So I'd really like to start with you and first of all, give you a chance to say a little bit about the work that you've been doing. The Institute itself, I think I read, has been around for over a decade. It calls itself a think and do tank, which I love. And it is mounting a soft power strategy to match the influence and impact of the increasingly sophisticated propaganda recruitment machineries of populist and extremist groups. Wow, that's a mouthful. Maybe if you could just take a few moments from the get-go and just tell us a little bit about your organization. And
thank you so much. That's not so succinct, is it? Well, firstly, just to say thank you. It's a huge privilege to be here. Everybody wants to come to Canada from far and wide. This is the place to be, and important to us all that it remains the great place that it's to be, of course. Just a couple of words on the Institute. So yes, I suppose just we've come at this set of issues really looking at extremist movements and their operations both offline and of course increasingly online over the last decade. And in a way, following them into the online space as they migrated into that domain, we started to build out our data analytics capabilities in order to be able to both understand better what they were doing, how they were operating, the levels at which they were coordinating domestically, internationally. And to do that across the ideological spectrum, we've been working on these issues across the ideological spectrum and really looking at extremism from the sharp tip of the problem, so from the violent tip of the spectrum of extremism through to the political challenges and the social challenges represented by these social movements. And as we migrated our capabilities into the online world, we started to understand that we were facing an ever more adept and technologically capable set of actors. And the gap between those malign actors and indeed those actors that we were seeing boosting their activities ever more frequently, state and non-state, but also the environments in which they were operating online, which were in many ways amplifying their activities and indeed amplifying extremist messaging writ large, were far more sophisticated, and we were being outpaced in many ways. So the gap between their operations and anything really in the counter space was rather large, and so we were determined that we would not only be in a position to understand and analyze these movements, but really trial, if you like, turn ourselves into an experiment and seek to trial interventions along that spectrum of the challenge to try to understand what might work, what doesn't work, and to share those experiences with policymakers, with practitioners, with the front line in all its shapes and forms, with civil society, with cities and so on. So we do a range of things at the organization, from research through to some quite innovative technology and communications programming, through to work with governments around policy and strategy, and the training of frontline workers.
Wow. So not a commercial, but I just was reading the 2019 EU elections report that you did, which is an information operations analysis on the EU elections, and surprised at just how specific the references are and the sort of like tangible examples, if I can put it that way, of manipulation. There's a phrase in here that we are all Russians now, which is I think trying to communicate that it is very it is more widespread than we might like to think.
Yeah.
This practice of leveraging social media to impact public opinion. Can you tell us a bit about that?
Yes, I mean, firstly, just a disclaimer on this report. This is just interim, quite swiftly drafted findings that we wanted to put out as a process. And the deep dive into the data that we've collected in the 3 to 4 months in the lead up to the European parliamentary elections is starting now. And so I would point you to the reports that we've done on a whole host of elections now, starting with the German federal elections in 2017. We've done a lot of work really across all the European parliamentary elections at national, but also at state level. The Bavarian elections were particularly interesting, where we saw all of these disinformation tactics and actors present first time in a way at a sub-state electoral level. So I would say that's maybe where the meat is. But this, and I think perhaps best for me to be speaking to the trends that we see. Evolution of the actors and the tactics, the toolkit to some extent that we see across this period of time, short as it may be, but it does give us a sense of how fast evolving that threat landscape is, and to some extent how behind the curve we tend to be. Mm-hmm. But the Russian question, so slightly editorialized. I'm not sure that it's quite true, but of course, everybody's attention after 2016 was really heavily on state actors, essentially Kremlin interference in elections.
2016 being the US general election.
Yes, indeed. And I think, you know, we were asked with the data analytics capabilities that we have, and we combine a set of tools which are, you know, social listening tools that are off the shelf available to anybody, with fairly deep dive anthropological research that we do across a range of closed and encrypted platforms and channels, where we're watching to some extent, I suppose, the early warnings of plotting and planning in the nether regions of the internet. And we're combining that with media monitoring, so to get an understanding really of that wider media ecosystem from the alt tech through to the mainstream media, as well as the social media space. And so we were asked really by a number of stakeholders to try to understand better what was happening with this Russian problem. And what we really found quite quickly was that the picture was much more complex, both in terms of the actors, but then of course also in terms of the tactics. And say, in terms of actors, just, you know, from the 2017 German elections, we saw this interesting dance between essentially international alt-right actors engaging with domestic extremist and populist networks, interplaying with Kremlin activity, and in many ways reinforcing, of course, each other's narratives and tactics. What we then saw afterwards was actually much less visible Kremlin activity. And whether we were looking at the Bavarian or the Swedish or indeed these European parliamentary elections, it was much harder to find obvious signs of Russian involvement. But there were a whole host of other actors using what many, I think, came to associate with Russian interference, that toolkit of digital manipulation, covert influence operations online. And again, we saw this combination of state, some indication of that. The smoking gun is very difficult. And with less and less access to the sort of data that we need in order to be able to establish who's behind these operations. I think this is the central question for the digital policy response we need to be looking at. It's very, very difficult to get a sense of real attribution, but nonetheless, what we saw is an increasing engagement and sophistication of the international alt-right playbook being played out with domestic actors and with local populist actors. This represents a much more difficult challenge for governments and indeed for the companies in looking at this problem. But in addition to that, we've also seen, a very, very fast evolving sort of set of tactics, which, perhaps we can discuss in a second.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, it sounds a bit like the evolution of warfare, where you have kind of symmetrical threats, state on state, and suddenly you go to asymmetrical, and it's been characterized by, in your report, as the move from kind of information warfare to more of a competition, a narrative competition.
Correct. It's but just on the state actor interference, I think it's also important to remember that there's more than just the Russian people. And we started to see some indications that the Poles were entering into that influence game during the Swedish elections. We are now going to be doing a deep dive into the media monitoring that we've done now in the lead up to these European parliamentary elections of Hungarian state media, Italian state media, Polish state media, and I would bet that there would be some activity there as well. So not to forget the state picture, it's still there. And again, not to say that the Russian interference isn't there, it's just that it's hard. It's going to be harder and harder, I think, to identify in a very clear ways. We have certainly some indications that it might be there. But in terms of what we're seeing, yes, we thought, I think, of, people talked about this as fake news. Disinformation was about fakery in terms of content and fakery in terms of distribution, botnets, sock puppet accounts, sort of obviously fake distribution vehicles. We're seeing less of that. And what we really see now is, in a way, the manipulation of real content from often credible sources, and the sort of establishment, the painting of a picture, of a story, that kind of content used out of context to paint a specific picture. But more specifically, we're seeing really long-range investments in information operations that are essentially designed to sow the seeds of a sort of culture war around wedge political and policy issues. And so we see now long-range investments in, one, the undermining of faith and trust in democratic process and institutions, including sort of sustained campaigns we've seen now in a number of these cases around electoral fraud, for instance, driven by far-right actors. Then we see, of course, migration as a sort of centerpiece of engagement, information operations. And again, it's not just about the elections, it's really about creating an investment in the cultural underpinnings of these movements long term. Migration, we see the importing now into a European context, which is new, of a kind of culture war around traditional family values versus progressive values, anti-LGBT, anti-women, major targeted harassment of female politicians, for instance, and public figures. And finally now, a sort of new entrant into this space, which is really the climate change conversation, which I think will be one of the pivotal domains around which we see misinformation turn, and in a way is now the new axis around which progressive versus more, let's say, reactionary forces are organizing. Transnational policy agendas are essentially being targeted one by one. And they're, as we saw with the UN the Global Compact, really systematized information operations that have had real-world impact.
And I suppose different countries might have different cleavages too that might be susceptible to this. And I'm thinking ahead we'll be bringing the other panelists on the Canadian experience, but there might be other fault lines, I guess, depending on the country for some of these forces that you're describing.
Yeah, correct.
Can you give us a tangible example of some of the techniques? I mean, you mentioned them briefly, but could you give us a bit more of an examples of some of the techniques that are being used, just so people can?
Yeah, I mean, it's often a combination of, so just to say, I think it's important to remember that there is a strategy behind much of this, and I think we tend to think of these sort of individuated information operations, and perhaps focus too much on the tactics and not on the fact that there is a strategy behind these operations. We see increasingly the international far-right actors coalesce. There is a connection of the dots on a fairly broad ideological basis. So the connection of a broad ideological church from the old racialist elements of the far-right movement through to the new culturalist, if you like, elements of the far-right movement. And you see very concerted efforts to communicate, to put out the right foot first in engaging different audiences. So you engage with normies, in a very different way to your hardcore base. You're conscious of who the messenger is and what the message is in order to be able to engage them and bring them on side. The project is a mainstreaming project and it's a polarization project. And again, these wedge issues are ways in which they mobilize that polarization. So it's important to know that. And tactically, how we see that working is, very coordinated sharing of manuals for information operations, meme banks, access to, content, meme banks. You see the weaponization of youth culture. You see sort of a lot of irony and imagery, stuff that gets quite difficult for, let's say, the tech companies and in fact policymakers to spot first off if they don't have that know-how. You see targeted harassment, hate speech, these sorts of things now really at a scale that is really significant. And just in terms of what we saw across these European parliamentary elections, this was a hate speech war in a way. We saw enormous quantities of accounts, content, channels that were just spewing in amounts of hate speech, reaching millions of people at the end of the day. Targeted harassment campaigns in relation to opponents, the delegitimation of opponents in very targeted ways. You still saw some fakery. It was there to be found. So here and there you came across it, but it just wasn't, the large majority was really in this hate speech space. So I would say, again, there is an entire information ecosystem that we need to be looking at. It isn't just happening on the mainstream platforms. Tactically, what's been happening is the establishment of alt media, alt tech spaces. And you see a kind of segregated information ecosystem now, where we saw this, just the data around, for instance, the German elections was critical. People who were voting AfD were essentially imbibing their information and news from alternative media platforms online. People who were not still imbibed mainstream news sources. And we are going to be seeing more and more of that segregated information environment, I think, impact how politics happens.
Now, it seems like it would be a lot more straightforward to counter if the tactics used are so, fantastic. Like if you have a Twitter bot that's tweeting every minute, no one I know does that 24 hours a day. So maybe it's easier to identify, and if there's 10,000 tweets, but where it's this more nuanced picture where the tactics are a little bit more sophisticated and sort of, that seems like a lot harder to get at. So,
and I should say just we were finding botnets, but not quite as obvious and not quite in the
Right.
scale of what we were seeing before. And so we found quite major botnets operating in Spain, pro-Vox, anti-Muslim botnets. We found, both Facebook and Twitter activity. We found similar sort of, pro-government, anti-Semitic botnets in Poland, and in the UK context, it was interesting. You have quite major bot activity around promoting all of the parties in the lead up to the elections, although most hyperactive around the Brexit Party. So you have, you have this type of activity. It's still to be found. I mean, the internet companies made big commitments to deal with that, explicitly sort of inauthentic activity, bot activity. They clearly weren't catching it all. Although there's less of it to be found than perhaps we would have seen before. But we have a tiny team doing this kind of analysis. We had some partner organizations doing things in other parts of Europe. But just in terms of what we were able to unearth, which of course is bound to just be the tip of the iceberg, the reach of these types of inorganic operations are absolutely vast.
And so you have a tiny team, if you could have the ear of governments and you could ask them to do one thing to counter this campaign that's happening in this ecosystem, what advice would you have for governments in terms of how to respond now?
Well, I'd say that, the thing that, hasn't worked is the self-regulation of the companies in relation to this set of challenges. From, the hate speech end of the spectrum through to the misinformation end of the spectrum. It just hasn't worked. And I'd say the number one challenge is, of course, access to the data that we need, that only the companies really have, for third-party review, so that we're able to establish, in actual reality, the scale of these types of operations and the extent to which there is a genuine response happening. We're now this is educated guesswork. It's very difficult to get a sense of the proportion of, what is the proportion to the whole of what we're actually seeing. So I would say a couple of things. I think up until now, it's quite interesting. The only policy or regulatory engagement of governments around this set of challenges has essentially been content oriented. So it's about content moderation or content removal. We desperately need to move beyond content moderation policy approaches and look at the technological architecture of these platforms and the way in which that essentially distorts the information ecosystem. We know, and that's sort of threefold. It's really to do with the way in which your data, my data, is harvested and utilized, and the intransparency around that, which is absolutely critical in the context of this set of problems that we face. It's to do with the sort of the advertising online business model, the advertising business model of the companies, but that ad tech marketing piece needs to be addressed. And then the algorithmic piece, all of which essentially tilt the platforms in favor of more and more extreme messaging and polarized messaging. And that part of the problem we've yet to really address. And I don't believe it will be addressed purely through requests of the companies to comply with those types of standards.
Fantastic. Well, I really like the idea of giving the government the access to the data, the tool for taking action as a first step. So we're going to bring the rest of the panel in, but first I would just like people to know that we are going to use Slido. So Slido, if you go to slido.com, you can download it as an app, or you can go to the website. I don't think they take any of your personal information or political views. The code is ISD 2019, so hashtag ISD 2019. You can submit your questions, and there'll be an opportunity. I'll read some at the end of our quick session here. But if any of the Slido votes get 20 upvotes, just 20 upvotes, I'll just stop when I won't ask my questions. I'll just ask the question from Slido. So if there's a question you really want to ask and 19 people agree with you, we'll ask it right away, and they're going to let me know if that takes place. So let me then just ask a few general questions to the panel just to kind of get things going. So first of all, So we've just heard Sasha say that governments need to get access to the data, that self-regulation is not enough. This implies action on the part of governments. So the first question I would just be interested to hear all of you address now is, in this context that Sasha's laid out, where we have an ecosystem of access, there are different influences. We are seeing trends, certainly in Europe, but let's say around the world, towards extremist voices amplifying themselves and propagating themselves on social media. What should government do now? What is the role or the duty of government to act? Ed, maybe we can start with you and just see if others.
And then turn to the government.
And then turn to the government, sure.
Okay, well, I'd say the first thing is that government needs to respect itself and its role that it plays in society in protecting the public interest. I think that to a large extent government had, and this is I think in the past tense, bought into a libertarian philosophy that was born in Silicon Valley, and also we don't understand this, and so we don't want to mess with it. We might break it, to
right.
use a term that was made famous by somebody else. But other folks have broken it already. So it's government's job, I think, to make sure that it doesn't get broken in such a way as to be a detriment to our democratic ways, our values, et cetera. So that's the first thing. And I just give a small example of that. When you still have a situation, as we do in Canada, where digital service companies, foreign digital service companies, pay less tax or no tax in terms of sales tax, whilst Canadian companies do pay it, or these companies don't pay tax in jurisdictions. In any case, I know the G20 is looking at addressing this now. That's not a self-respecting government to me, in the sense of furthering the interest of people. I mean, you allow the tax base to erode to start with and have unfair application. So that would be the first thing. The second thing I'd say is that this is a really difficult problem. So I don't want to. It's easy for people who aren't in government to make it sound easy. As Sasha described, you have a mixture of dissent and deceit and disparagement, all kind of together, and dissent is legitimate. Obviously, in society, disparagement has some kind of line between, I'm not a fan of people who think that we should ban hurtful speech. I'm okay with hurtful speech. I'm not okay with hate speech, and there's a line there. And of course, deceit is, the willful perpetration of disinformation, of falsehood, to mislead the public. That seems to me an offense against our values that governments should stand up against. But it is difficult and it is confusing. We live in this public square, a digital public square. It's moved online, and moving online, it's become phenomenally permeable. And that's a good thing, because I used to be, as you know, a newspaper editor, and as a newspaper editor, I was a gatekeeper. And who knows? I might have entirely missed the Me Too movement. I might have said, "That's not interesting. That's not a story." I hope I wouldn't have, but I could have. So the fact that we've opened up our democratic expression is a wonderful thing. But what we do also with very little gatekeeping, with micro-targeting, with some of the attributes, and this is the last point I want to go to, of this system, just raises the need for some very hard public policy thinking. The Public Policy Forum got into this discussion ourselves because of that very reason. We sort of came in not through extremism, but through the decline of journalism, and what that would mean. And in so doing, I think the final point is, as I say, is that it was a famous Canadian who said the medium was the message, and I keep wondering if somebody could go to the movie and pull Marshall McLuhan out of the line for Annie Hall or something and find out what this medium means, because I can think how television changed newspapers, and television needed personality, needed pictures. It took you there. There were certain qualities to the medium. This medium has certain qualities too. And many of them, some of them are good, and many of them are very negative. It prefers opinion over fact. It appears very much emotion outrage, particularly over reason, to keep people online and to keep clicks, because the unit value of a piece of advertising is very low. So you need to get a lot of units to make money, and they've actually been very good at getting a lot of units. It values the globally scalable over the locally relevant. It values we all know something over expertise, which is how you get to vaccination problems and that. So I think that we need to study the medium is the message. I think we need to study the Canadian media ecosystem. We know that the Russians set up one of the obscure Facebook groups in the United States was an anti-fracking group in Texas. I don't think we have any idea what goes on in Canada in terms of political debate and who is fomenting what.
Mm-hmm. Interesting. So we'll hear from the other two panelists, and then I'm going to go to the Slido because I see we've broken the threshold. But Adam.
So I'm not speaking for the Government of Canada. Just to clarify that, I will speak for my organization, though, CSIS. And maybe in talking a little bit about sort of our work and our mandate and what we do in this space, it'll lend an appreciation to the fact that governments and intelligence services are not all-knowing and all-powerful, and we have very circumscribed powers. I mean, we have great powers we can use in the right circumstances, but in particular when you're talking about speech online, freedom of thought, we tread very carefully. So, as an security intelligence organization, we're mandated to look at threats to the security of Canada, terrorism, espionage, sabotage, proliferation. We have a range of powers that go from the fairly benign, sort of, general inquiry to quite intrusive. And on the intrusive side, we require court warrants and approvals from our ministers. So we don't go down that road lightly. We also have in our act very plain language that prohibits us from investigating lawful advocacy, protest, and dissent. And I think some of those terms have already been used here. And that is a no-go zone for us, with the assumption that there isn't some sort of threat activity going on in that space. So foreign influence activity, that's a threat under our act, and that's sort of the prism through which we would look at what we're calling here misinformation, which is probably not an ideal term in our parlance. I prefer information operations, and that term was as well, because what we are focused on in that space is foreign state proliferated information. So information operations or foreign influence operations behind which there is a foreign state, about which the activity is detrimental to Canada. And lastly and importantly, activity that is clandestine or deceptive. So if a foreign state is doing this activity in a very open manner or in the normal course of diplomacy, again, that's not something we would investigate. So there are challenges in executing that mandate in this space. It's getting more difficult. Attribution is obviously key for us, and attribution is getting more difficult. But I would say, and just to kind of wrap it up and bring it back to the question of what can governments do, certainly what the service can do for the government is bring intelligence and information to their attention that allows decision makers, policy makers to script and design the right answers to these problems. And so we're very active in that regard. And as a final point on sort of the harder and sharper end of the tools available, the service also has a more recent threat diminishment mandate. So it goes beyond just collecting intelligence and providing it to government. where the government so desires, we can actually intervene in events and change events. So that again is a power that you could envision being used in this space.
Okay, thank you. Owen.
So it is National Public Service Week, so I will be the good public servant and remind folks that their government actually has been doing a lot of work in this space. And under the leadership of our democratic institutions colleagues, there's really been a whole of government effort to really coordinate our thinking about these issues. And I think what's perhaps not a uniquely Canadian approach, but you certainly haven't seen many like it in the world, and I've had the chance to speak with colleagues in France and the UK and Australia and Germany, is that, you know, the fact that I'm up here with Adam, a culture department guy, with, you know, someone from sort of the public safety portfolio is quite interesting, right? And I think the way that the government is thinking about this, from sort of ensuring citizen preparedness to thinking about kind of institutional resilience, how we ensure that our political parties, our media system, our governments are equipped to deal with this issue, to the foreign interference angle that we've focused on to date, to also sort of the social media is a positive sign. I think, you know, we've been doing a lot of thinking on these issues over the last 2 years. I think our focus is kind of on some of those more medium-term to long-term questions about, you know, I think Sasha alluded to it, and Ed too, about kind of the informational ecosystem, right? And we're the culture department, and, you know, are you know, partly stewards of that informational ecosystem, that content layer. And so, you know, if I were to sort of summarize how we think about that, right, it's been kind of grounded in principles of accountability. It's been grounded in principles of transparency, right? So the issue of data is one that frustrates me significantly as someone who gives advice as well, because you don't have the window into the thing that you really need to give advice on some of these issues. And then one here in Canada on sort of a diversity of voices, right? Ensuring that content layer, whatever you want to call it, reflects our official language minority communities. It reflects, you know, the diversity of Canadian expression. It reflects local journalism, people who are committed to holding, you know, officials and politicians account for those actions. I think the challenge is, you know, and again, I think Sasha alluded to it, you know, we've moved from an architectural level from sort of a broadcast model where content was simply pushed out to a distributed kind of network, right? Where indeed, like, you know, I can tweet out and I'm in some sense, you know, broadcasting a message. So it is, you know, it is challenging to think about how you address some of those long-standing policy concerns in that new environment. And I think, you know, to Adam's point, you know, we are Canada and we are trying to balance multiple competing policy objectives where we don't want to undermine freedom of expression. We don't want to undermine the drive for innovative businesses that are going to serve Canadians better. We don't want to undermine freedom of assembly. And so how you strike the right course on that, knowing that at the end of the day, the actions of Canada will be held up as an example to others, is really important, that we think about this and get it and try to get it right. And so at Canadian Heritage, I mean, we've been really pleased. We received $7 million from the government to supplement digital and media civic literacy training in advance of the federal election. So that is going to things like additional awareness sessions, training sessions, tools development, better understanding of how information is portrayed to you. You know, personalization algorithms are great, but we need to understand, you know, my parents need to understand, my friends need to understand how that information is actually selected and presented to you. And then this last budget included an additional investment of $19.4 million to really think about some of these research and policy development issues on a longer term, right? So money there for additional research, money there for an international engagement strategy to make sure we are working with our colleagues across the world. So.
Great. And what's the name of that program again, Owen?
Digital Citizen Initiative.
Digital Citizen. Okay, excellent. Well, as advertised, we have a question. I think, Sasha, this may be in the first instance for you, which is, given the research that you've done in the European examples, there's many different types of electoral systems at play, proportional representation, first past the post, electoral colleges. In your experience, are there some electoral systems that are more or less susceptible to this type. And we could invite others to chime in, but really, Sasha, interested in your views on this.
I mean, it's very interesting. I think that that has a bearing on outcome. I mean, it has a bearing on essentially how effectively this can be turned into electoral outcome that has, you know, a bearing on government and governance. So yes, first past the post systems, it's still harder for fringe parties to get into government. Doesn't mean that the system isn't vulnerable to misinformation. I think all of our systems are vulnerable to misinformation.
Right.
One of the things I highlight beyond, you know, the point I made about regulating the social media space is that actually what we desperately need is a public debate about the rules of the road in relation to political mobilization in the internet era. Is it legitimate to be using bots in the context of political campaigning? Is it legitimate for anonymous accounts to be used in the context of political campaigning? Is transnational political mobilization acceptable? All of these are, you know, questions we need to be, you know, putting on the table and answering, and ultimately coming to some kind of public consensus, which then has the buy-in of mainstream political parties. Because micro-targeting is micro-targeting, an acceptable means. Now, as we see the misinformation space get more and more nuanced in terms of its tactics and mobilization, I mean, much of it you ask, you know, is it transgressive? How different is it from the sort of political campaigning that we see of mainstream parties? We see bot activity across mainstream parties and so on. So there are these, I think, bigger conversations to be had around the rules of the road in the digital era. There's also the issue of, you know, what we do about illegal activity. And, you know, much of what we see is fundamentally illegal. It's illegal hate speech, it's harassment, it's defamation. The problem is that enforcement of law online is particularly challenging for all sorts of reasons, not least the fact that it lies with the and cost is high. And so we desperately need to have an audit of existing law and how it applies or not online. What are the mechanisms by which we might be able to better enforce existing law? It doesn't need a new set of laws, it needs the application of existing law. So I would say beyond some of those areas, that's desperately needed. In order to have apply online, you need an upskilling of the entire system. So it isn't enough to just say digital education for kids. We need our law enforcement and courts and you know, policy constituencies to be enabled with systems and skills, and that, I think, you know, so we are very vulnerable as a whole, I think, irrespective of the voting system.
Right. Though, let me just, would it be a Canadian complacency to think that a first past the post system with an unelected, this sounds undemocratic, with an unelected Senate actually insulates you from fringe extremist movements, or is that wrong-headed?
So I think it speaks to the point, you know, that there are a lot of questions that have to be answered in this space. And so, you know, when I brief on this issue, I mean, the question is, but is that true in Canada, always comes up, right? And, you know, I think, you know, there's been some research and good research coming out of other jurisdictions, right? You know, many of you may have caught kind of the report that kind of divided, you know, the United States up into 3 tribes. You had kind of the Bernie tribe, the Hillary tribe, and then the Republican tribe, right? And that was using the Twitter data that was available, right? And you kind of, you know, is that true in Canada? And I think the point is that there are lots of questions that of that type, those research questions that actually need to be answered about the impact on our official language communities, about the impact on our diasporan communities, about, you know, the institutional architecture of Canada, you know, that our media system, but I think those are very specific questions where you need to be careful about extrapolating and saying, you know, sort of a political science level, you know, we all need to migrate to this kind of political system because, I mean, there's so many other factors at play. And so I think it's really about identifying, you know, very precisely some of those things and then trying to work on the tools that help address perhaps some of the shortcomings or gaps, right, or weaknesses or vulnerabilities in the system.
I would also just caution against a kind of traditional, a kind of picture of fringe versus mainstream. fringe is increasingly becoming mainstream. That's been the project, and it's succeeding in many contexts. Not everywhere, but it is. I mean, the AfD now is, the main opposition party in Germany. Who could have imagined such a thing even 5 years ago? So just, I think we need to be quite careful about what we term fringe.
Yeah, I don't think that the most germane fact is what is the electoral system. I think the most germane fact is that there are some groups of people who have greater ability to weaponize now, and perhaps greater grievance to drive that, and certainly greater capacity to find one another, to use the tools of this new digital public sphere to undermine political consensus, to undermine trust, to undermine, to confuse people, to divide people. So, so then, you get to, okay, what do you do about that? And, first off, let me, if I was at all critical about the government's tax policy, I don't mean this government, I mean all governments, but I've seen an amazing sea change in the government of Canada. I could feel it starting in the fall of 2017, when a lot of when a whole bunch of newspapers were closing down, and when people were seeing the repercussions of disinformation, and they were starting to catch up with the 2016 election reality and the Brexit reality. So there's been a lot of movement, but as Sasha says, there's so much that we don't know, and so much that we're not prepared to figure out yet. And government can only move in a certain relationship with public opinion, and public opinion needs to have a good debate. Public opinion needs to have a good debate about what works and what doesn't work in people call it digital literacy or media literacy. I think we're really talking about critical faculties. I think we're talking about civic infrastructure in a much greater way. Does competition policy work anymore? Well, we're hearing very authoritative people telling us that the competition policy mindset that we have, which is one around pricing to consumers, is not an adequate framework for anymore, and actually wasn't an adequate framework before it became the framework. So we need to think about that. And certainly the questions, the really, really perplexing questions about what you do about speech that is intended to cause great public mischief. So in Canada, one of the sort of oddities of Canada that I discovered in the process of the last couple of years is that there is a section of the criminal code, an orphan section of the criminal code, section 181, which is the fake news section of the criminal code. And it was declared unconstitutional in 1992 by a 4-3 Supreme Court of Canada decision. If you read the decision, and I've just reread the decision, I read it 2 years ago and I read it just in the last few weeks. If you read that decision, you would actually think it would flip a different way today, because there wasn't enough necessity around it, and the three dissenters are particularly persuasive, but even the assenters would change their mind. Now, I don't know if we should have a section 181 of the criminal code. What I know is that in the 1960s, we had a commission in Canada that had a very good public conversation about whether we should have anti-hate laws. And that was tough. And we had that public discussion, and I think just we need to have further public discussions, and we need to promote those. I hope the unit that Owen's talking about, will do that kind of work.
Mm-hmm. Well, I'm sure he will now. But, this is a good segue to the next Slido question, which is, even if the government did intervene in the criminal code or through regulation, it is but one country acting and against global tech companies and global movements. So I guess the question is what can Canada do on its own? And really a question for all panelists. Maybe Owen, I'll start with you and just kind of move down the right-hand side.
Yeah, so I think this is very germane, and it's not unique to Canada, right? You talk to our colleagues internationally, and everybody is experiencing the same challenges in the sense of, smaller markets. You have a rep that is based here, that understands the domestic market, but a lot of the big policy decisions of these platforms are driven out of their head office, right? And so I think that's why the international coordination piece is so critical, and it's been something that we've been trying to advance in terms of saying those countries that share a similar value set to Canada, share similar principles. We need to make sure that we're driving in the same direction, and need to make sure that as we engage the platforms, they understand that there is a broader coalition of democracies that are asking for similar type of things, and I think that's really important. And then you need to think about kind of that larger block, and saying to Sasha's point, I mean, I think the tactics will evolve, right? And again, that's why I really think the heart of this problem is how we articulate our expectations of what, to Ed's point, the kind of digital public sphere looks like, acknowledging though that the digital public sphere, like, I engage on Twitter, for in the public sphere, so to speak, but then I use other platforms in very personal ways as well, right? So the digital public sphere is a very nuanced space, and that we all, I think, recognize that we share photos of our kids sometimes, but we also use it in, that public sphere kind of way. And so, I mean, it needs to be a very nuanced conversation. And in order to do that, though, everybody kind of needs to be reading from a similar script in terms of what the real critical pieces of it are.
Right. Adam, anything to add when a Canadian intelligence service takes on the global tech giants?
Yeah, so I mean, regulation is certainly not my forte, regulation of social media or high-tech industry. So I wouldn't have an opinion really on the question specifically, but what I would say is that from the perspective of an intelligence service and watching the foreign influence threat over time, what I would say is it's, our adversaries adapt. The sort of most recent incarnation with social media is being driven by new technology today, but we've been dealing with essentially the same problem for decades. We have seen it in our collection, foreign states trying to alter the course of elections, trying to change opinions within diaspora. They've used various techniques to do it. They're still today using the good old-fashioned techniques, traditional media, for example. I mean, there's lots of other ways they're doing it. So I suppose the point I'm making is only that we shouldn't think that a single change such as regulation will address the threat long term. I mean, it's got to be looked at in its totality, in terms of all the activity, and it needs to be coordinated, because I think what you would find is that trying to tamp things down here will mean that someone will find a new way, and it'll raise its head over here.
Mm-hmm.
Can I ask Adam a question? I'm just, you said, earlier in your answer now also, that, the foreign intrusion, foreign intervention is kind of your doorway in, and I understand the CSIS Act, I think number B tells you foreign, 2B or something, but, but if you had domestic terrorism, presumably CSIS would be interested in that. So is a foreign involvement a necessity for you to be involved?
No, so, and you're quite right. Under another section of our Act, we'd be interested in what we're terming misinformation online, on social media platforms, which is advocating violent extremism. Our mandate would engage on that. But it wouldn't be, so who's doing it at that point is secondary to us, in the sense that if it's a foreign state that's pushing that information or not, the point for us would be it may be motivating people to violent acts within Canada. And that's how we would engage on that front. First and foremost, in an effort to diffuse what can be a threat to Canadian life. As a secondary, yeah, we'd probably be looking at who is proliferating the information and following up in that regard.
Sasha?
Yes, I mean, to pick up on this, I think that, that line between state and non-state actor, between domestic and international, between sort of legitimate and illegitimate activity is, increasingly really very blurred. But we have been, I think there is a way in which to create a framework that looks very specifically at, as you say, sort of clandestine. So we look at malign information operations and define them according to how deceptive, distortive, or illegal they are. And in a way that looks at behaviors rather than specifically at content. Those certain types of content, of course, are illegal. And so we look at, say, violent extremist content or hate speech that is illegal in different country contexts. So I think there is a framework there that can be deployed that that operates irrespective of politics, which is important to be able to operate. Just on this point about regulation and the internet companies, we do need to have. We've been trying to establish this digital policy lab of governments, essentially Five Eyes plus key European governments. The UK government, the German government, the French governments are all either regulating or looking to regulate, and there are big, it's there also at an EU level. I think it's absolutely vital that we do this on a transatlantic basis. I think the US will let's see where that goes. But even in the US, we've started to see certain windows open to the puncturing of intermediary liability for the very first time. This is, within the next 5 years, I'd be surprised if we weren't seeing a very, very different policy environment for this. But what hasn't happened yet is a kind of working space for governments to genuinely get their a handle on how to come together around this policy challenge, beyond the sort of big policy utterances of a G7 and it needs to happen in a much more concerted way.
I think there's a really interesting phenomena going on in the world of like-minded countries outside of established institutions beginning to get together around issues. Not just in this issue, it's happening in trade, in Canada's relations with some countries at a table that doesn't include China and the United States, for instance. And we see it with the Grand Committee that was met in Ottawa a couple of weeks ago of parliamentarians. We see it, Canada and UK, the foreign ministers of both countries. If the current foreign minister of the UK is still the foreign minister in July, are meant to co-host So, a lot of like it, and especially my organization. And I think this is really interesting the lessons of using each other, working with each other. That small do a thing, do whatever you want within our society that's politically reasonable, obviously. The sort of Canada criticized rule Google had something on because it's dictatorial, but it's one thing to take Canada. After that, it's your problem. So I think what we do is we have institutions that care about national sovereignty.
And the space is opening up even at the government official level, right? So we hosted a 2-day workshop here in February that, UK was there, France was there, and that report was just published online in terms of thinking about things around, how do you increase transparency around algorithmic decision making, how do you address issues around disinformation, how do you, promote the discoverability of local content. We hosted a delegation from DG Connect a couple weeks ago who was in town. This was one of the topics on the agenda, right? So I think, every good sort of policy group, is very seized with this because it's challenging sort of the traditional way of thinking about some of these issues.
And as an emergent area, I mean, there must be a premium for a leadership position of, the country or the group of countries that put out a position and sort of are leading the pack. I'm sure will have a disproportionate impact, on the world for that matter. There are a couple of other Slido questions, so let's We have the question, and I think we've touched on this already, but about whether they're state actors or non-state actors. So maybe just a quick answer to the question about, is misinformation also performed by government authorities?
Oh, yes. Yes.
And you document some of that in your report.
Correct. I mean, well, and and we did find evidence of Kremlin misinformation across the German elections. I mean, in a number of other contexts. And as I said, we still see, for instance, Sputnik as a great mouthpiece of consistent amplification in favor of, for instance, specific populist parties in the context of elections in Europe. So through traditional media channels as well as online. And as you said, I mean, this is happening. The toolkit is much broader than just the sort of social media context, and we certainly see some evidence across Europe of more traditional co-option tactics being deployed, and we will continue to see that. Again, my hope, and I also believe that we will see new entrants into the state influence and interference context as we see these nationalist parties come into government in many parts of Europe. I mean, people sort of somewhat breathed a sigh of relief at the end of the European parliamentary elections. They imagined that the problem might have been bigger. But nonetheless, in the sort of 4 of the 6 major markets in Europe are still facing sizable electoral wins of nationalist groups. And there is a wider strategic playbook here of authoritarian nationalism, which is being deployed, which, in the first place is the co-option of the information environment. But in the second place then is really around the co-option of institutions. And we start to see that in many places now. So in Italy, in Poland, in Hungary, beyond state media being deployed in that direction, you also see the co-option of, the undermining of independent judiciary, and so on and so forth. This is a bigger playbook.
Right, including, as you mentioned earlier, campaigns against specific individuals as well.
Absolutely.
Smear campaigns.
Absolutely.
Perhaps it's my journalistic training, but I read that question completely different from you.
Oh, did you?
Just, yeah.
Oh, right on.
What it said is, are there examples of misinformation from government authorities? I'm sure that it was, I thought it was talking about, our own government.
Oh my gosh.
I kind of read it that way.
I read it that way
It's
too.
cynical, guys.
But I think it's an important one, because I mean it speaks to the issue of trust, right? And trust in government, and for everybody in the room and online who works for the public service, right? I mean, it's something we need to be really seized with, because we are in many cases the authoritative source on things that we certify and advice that we put out, right? And so if the public starts to lose trust in those, I mean, that becomes a real policy issue that we need to grapple with. I would say too, for me, there's a distinction between misinformation and disinformation, whereas the latter is kind of the intentional misleading, whereas misinformation, it may be inaccurate, but it may have been an oversight or mistake, right? And I think, interestingly, I mean, both are I think, an issue on the rise, you could say. I mean, when we look at in the media space, right, fewer reporters, more pressure to produce, right, less time to fact check, right? So more risk that issues around misinformation creep into sort of reporting on issues, right? And then to Sasha's point, I mean, more and more the tactics are about the manipulation real content. So you have a strategic leak that has many real emails in them, but there's one that's been doctored, and then that's what gets picked up, right? So I mean, it's hard to.
But also there's misinformation. I mean, I think there's also a question here about whether, are Western governments doing this in other parts of the world and so on. There is propaganda, and propaganda's always been about. I think there is a distinction between overt and covert operations. I mean, essentially, and this isn't to say that the West hasn't been involved in both, but just to say that there is a distinction there, and we need to be clear about it. And again, it's part of a public debate around what is legitimate and what is illegitimate. Putting out, your own ideas about how things should be, or engaging in the public and political discourse of other countries in itself may not be a problem, but doing it in a distortive or deceptive way or a covert way, I think, is problematic and important for us to be talking about that.
So another question, interested in views on indicators that we are dealing with a concerted strategy or with a strategy to mass produce misinformation or hateful speech. So how do we know that what is real and what is fake is the question.
So again, dealing with strategy and mass produce, well, again, what we look at is, I suppose, the nature of the distribution, the behavior around the distribution. Is it authentic or inauthentic, number one? And there are indicators of inauthentic activity. So there are indicators, for instance, that researchers use to try to identify bot activity. And just sort of weird hyperactive types of activity. That said, botnets, cyborg nets are becoming more sophisticated, and they're designed to trick people into believing they are in fact human. And so there's a lot of this becomes a bigger and bigger challenge. There's also, of course, just the paying of vast networks of people to do your bidding. And there is a question in much of the research that we've done just lately in relation to the European parliamentary elections, how much of the hyperactivity online of, let's say, the populist parties massively outpaced mainstream parties in their Facebook engagement around the issue of the European parliamentary elections. Was made, if you see the comparative rates of Facebook engagement, it's absolutely extraordinary. It seems fishy. And indeed, in the AfD context, some research was done that found some 200,000 seemingly fake accounts behind, pushing out AfD content. But again, it's very difficult for us to get, the attribution is now an impossible, really, for researchers today, given the type of data we have access to. And I think to some extent governments too. And so this, again, is a big question. How do we get the companies to enable third-party review of that type of operation?
So let me ask the others, is there a smoking gun? Is there evidence, or do we yet have that evidence?
Well, there's a lot of smoke. I'm not sure there's a single pistol in the room. Look, we're about, when I say we, so the Public Policy Forum and McGill University's Max Bell School of Public Policy have a arrangement, something that we're calling the Digital Democracy Project, and we've have 3 activities under this. And the first activity we've done, which was a workshop for journalists, which people like Sash, who have experience with elections outside of Canada, spoke and came and trained about 60 journalists, Canadian journalists, in what to look for and how you see these signs of that. And then secondly, we will be looking in the election campaign at what is going on in the media ecosystem in the way that ISD has done. And then we will take this into a policy development stage. What do we learn about policy? In doing that, I just think, as has been said on this panel already, the easiest place to start is radical transparency. I mean, there's some very difficult questions, but the radical transparency questions don't seem difficult to me. And when you see the opposite of transparency, you have moments to hesitate. So in the United States election, there was a site called End the Fed, which was a very successful perpetrator of disinformation. Disinformation being very attractive to people to start with and very inexpensive to produce. So it has certain market advantages, if you like. But nobody could find out who the owner in the Fed was. So on every broadcaster and newspaper, the name of the publisher, the editor, and the proprietor are required to be there. So for the very least, you know who to sue. And so that should be
not so radical.
Both a sign and not terribly radical. If bots are being used, that should be known. There's all kinds of elements like that, and I think a session is when those elements are missing, when you don't know who is behind something, when they're hiding out. In a country where dissident, that may be in Iran, you can understand that. But I don't think in Canada you can.
Mm-hmm.
But that question around what is real and what is fake, we're about to be hit, of course, with deep fake, which will make it extremely difficult for people to know what is real and what is fake. I'm sure, this is in a way a technological race to be able to unpick the technologies that are going to unpick us. But these will be massive challenges going forward. And
but that's why a little bit part of the problem's got to be teaching citizens about how to use the tools at their disposal to identify that, because it's going to evolve, right? So, one of my observations is we've been plugged into some work that the World Economic Forum has been doing and leading in the United States. And, the Silicon Valley, while home to all the big giants, is also home to a lot of interesting kind of startup. Think about how you develop the plugins that helps you, identify where else this is being talked about on the web, the annotation tools, right, in the journalism space. I think the Trust Project, which is about, getting journalists to come together and cross-check things before something goes to print. So, I mean, there's a lot of interesting work going on, right? And I think so part of this, again, I was commenting to Adam earlier that my observation is there's still a bit of a divide between sort of what's going on in Europe in the civil society space and what's going on in the Americas in the civil society space. And so we need to sort of encourage that cross-pollination as really smart people working not only in government but in civil society lean into these problems.
If the onus is on someone to prove that something is fake, that's a very hard onus. That's that the needle is not in the haystack onus. And I think of the disinformation, misinformation, if you like. I think it was disinformation around and him paying for the caravan that went on during the midterm election campaign. And you have something that went from a single person who was in a Donald Trump Facebook group, Loretta the Prole, that's where it started, on Loretta the Prole's Facebook site, to over 5 or 6 days, 47 million, and then Donald Trump Jr. and congressmen tweeted, and then it exploded even more than that. And then 5 or 6 days later, you have a pipe bomb at George Soros' house. Now, nobody can prove any causality there. Well, at some point, maybe somebody will be able to prove causality, as they did in the Bizanet. You can sort of see, what people were doing in the days before and how they may have been influenced. But you can, I think you can infer certain things completely. There's Justin Trudeau out there converting to Islam on a site called the Vatican Inquirer. Now, since the Vatican Inquirer doesn't exist, I don't know that Justin Trudeau hasn't converted to Islam. I do know the pictures actually were him taking his son out at Halloween, reversed imaged, and taking him out, his son as the little prince, and so he was wearing a hat, a scarf, and so I just don't know if that can be the onus. I think it's incumbent on people who are doing research to just point out these things and the anomalies of it, and not necessarily draw the conclusion unless something's really discernibly, absolutely, totally. You can say, here's Obama's birth certificate. I don't think he's born in Kenya, but
But part of the issue, Ed, right, is it's the science article, right? Like and we didn't talk. We alluded to it, but there's a huge human psychology component, behavioral problem at the root of some of these issues that, we are drawn to sensational content, right? And so when you combine some of those problems, and again, this is kind of back to Sasha's point about the architecture of the whole thing and how these things are interlinked, right? But if human, we've got to think about, okay, so what are the behavioral economic sort of nudges that we can try to, encourage people to adopt and bake into the system that are going to, before you sort of share the shark swimming down, Houston street photo, you pause for 30 seconds, you do a little bit of a Google search, or you use that reflex that you've been taught, right? Like, that's a hard space to get to, right? But otherwise, I fear we're just in this loop about reacting to sort of, again, the next wave of technological innovation that's going to be used by both sides.
Now, for public servants that are participating, we've always had a detect and correct kind of function of government. So if I'm working at Environment Canada, people are making claims that are not based on science. It's generally understood that if I was a public servant at Environment, I should be doing detect and correct. I should detect when something is a mistruth, and I should do my best to correct that impression through whatever means necessary. What we're talking about here goes well beyond that kind of traditional detect and correct because it's a campaign and because it goes outside. So, who would detect and correct a claim about a birth certificate or a religious conversion or just trolling activity if it falls outside of that mandate? Any thoughts about sort of the stance that public servants and departments should take in their spheres of influence?
I mean, I do believe we're going to need to have this systematized to be really effective because, as you've said, there's lots of really great initiatives out there. There's fact-checking initiatives. There's digital literacy and citizenship programs. We've been involved in it. But all of these are sort of piecemeal, because they're not universalized. So digital citizenship education, I think, great if it's universalized. And it needs to be future-proofed, and the entire system needs upskilling. It isn't just young people. It's older people. It's government. It's and so on and so forth. So there's a bigger job to be done there. But in terms of the data and the exposure of and somewhere that people can come and say, this has just happened to me. What happened? What do we do about it? How do I redress this? I think that has to be a public service, potentially paid for by the companies, but there needs to be some form of economies of scale around the analysis of these types of operations. The tools are actually quite expensive. Not everybody should have to go at them and try and figure this out. This shouldn't be left to a bunch of researchers that, try and get to the bottom of this. There needs to be some form of public service around this.
I don't want to put up a case for supporting journalism, but and there's $595 million on a panel that's going to figure it all out. But journalism is very weak in this country. Local journalism is extremely weak. You have places like St. Catharines and Kingston that now have maybe 5 journalists in an entire newsroom. And still working on pointing out corruption in St. Catharines or building empathy in Humboldt, Saskatchewan, where a reporter there just won Journalist of the Year from the National Newspaper Awards. I think those capacities are very important. The Globe and Mail is just doing a buyout, and they're going to go from 250 journalists to closer to 200 journalists over the next, by the end of August probably. And that will reduce their capacity, particularly to do investigative journalism of the kinds of things that we're talking about here. Because traditional journalism is still actually very highly trusted in this country. And that's an independent body to kind of say, here's what's going on in the world and the environment. But it's losing its capacity to do that kind of work. You see some amazing work in the United States. From a bunch of institutions, from ProPublica to traditional institutions, pointing out things that are going on with the platforms and untruths that are going on. I know the George Soros thing because I read it in a newspaper. And I think we just have to be careful not to lose that as yet another base that wakes up every day saying, what's actually really going on in the world. It fails every day to get there, but it wakes up with the best of intentions every day.
I think as well, there's definitely a role there for government, the security intelligence side, to speak a little more openly about the phenomenon as well, right? I mean, you asked the question about smoking guns. Have we got smoking guns? I mean, we do, but we can't talk about them publicly. But what we can do is talk publicly in a more general way about the phenomenon, about what we're seeing, about the states involved, about the dynamics of it. And I think you're seeing slowly my organization, our sister organization, the Communications Security Establishment, coming out of the shadows a little bit and wanting to talk more openly about it. The CSE, for example, has published a number of reports in the lead up to the election where they talk about cyber activity and this sort of targeting on social media. So there's certainly a role for that. And this is me getting, these are my personal views. I really do believe that educating the Canadian public is, if you're going to do one thing right, do that. Because going back to my original comment, the tactics are going to change. if you give your Canadian public a foundation for understanding that there are foreign states and actors looking to manipulate their opinion, they're going to be alive to that no matter where they're getting their information. And if you can sort of arm them with a challenge function in that respect at the earliest stage in schools, I personally think that's very important and the way to go.
And that means acknowledging that, you know, the Globe and Mail won't be everybody's trusted source of news, right? But what's important is that, I mean, everybody think about what their trusted sources are and be prepared to kind of say, okay, if this trusted source that I have says something different than the National Post or the Globe and Mail or the Ottawa Citizen or Journal de Montréal, like, why is it and how are they just, like, again, to Ed's point, it's about that critical thinking, right? And stop. I mean, I know it seems intuitive, but you know, I encourage all of us to challenge function, even when we are engaging on social media. The like, have you read the entire thing before you click share, right? Like, did you actually make it more than 10 to 15% of the way through? Because that's the stats show. That's kind of where most of us stop, right? And so,
and we've had this conversation without talking about CBC and Radio Canada, but it's worth adding that in terms of trusted sources of news, I mean, the government invests quite significantly in that in this country.
And well-resourced, you know, compared to everybody else.
Yeah.
And indeed, both CBC and particularly Radio Canada, they're ahead of everybody in terms of what we're talking about. You know, they both set up units inside them to you know, discern disinformation and work in the campaign. And I don't know why Radio Canada is so ahead of everybody else, because in this workshop we did, you could see, you know, who's done a lot of work, and they have done a lot of work.
Fantastic. Well, there is a risk that foreign actors are influencing this conversation through Slido, so I will take a question in the room. So if anyone does have a question, there are microphones here. Donc, si vous voulez, s'il vous plaît, poser une question, un commentaire à notre panel ici. But in the meantime, I will go to the first question, which is a very pratique question, which is, you know, a couple of you have mentioned tactics or methods or citizen information or journalist information. Are these kinds of tools available for public servants or for Canadians at large?
So there are methodologies, and again, I genuinely believe that we need to be building a kind of open source platform for data tools and analysis for anybody that really wants to get to the bottom of this, to be able to use many of the tools that are used now to analyze this space are essentially black box commercial tools, and more needs to be done to create those sorts of platforms. So there are methodologies used to identify bots and ways that we get to understanding the extent to which an actor is behaving maliciously, so deceptively, distortively, or illegally. Again, we could share those methodologies. But on the data is increasingly not available. So since the companies shut, you know, their API, Facebook shut its API, it's becoming increasingly difficult to really, you know, get the data required. And again, I think there is a desperate need to create, even if it's sort of a consortia of research organizations that are given anonymized data by companies to be able to look into this, but in a real-time way, not just historically, but just in, you know, real time, to be able to understand and then provide that insight to populations that really need it. Again, it's a public service that isn't, I think, happening now at scale.
Anything to add? No?
Well, I think it's been interesting throughout the last couple of years that every time certain platforms have said, you know, so many people were exposed to Facebook, fake Facebook groups, and then, you know, somebody like Jonathan Albright at Columbia would say, actually, you know, he got in a little wormhole and was able to figure out that the number was different, so then they shut that wormhole. And with Cambridge Analytica, and over again, you have this. So I think the point of public services and, you know, people who have a public interest, these are, you know, exceptionally powerful corporations that have a disproportionate influence on public decision making, and therefore, you know, the public interest, you know, has to supersede it without undermining their business models. You know, there's no need to.
Right.
Those two things are easily reconcilable.
Great. Well, we'll take a question here in the room. Yeah, please.
This question is about misinformation as opposed to disinformation. I have a lot of hope for all of the tools that can detect, bot networks and things like that through social analysis and shut those things down. Platforms are taking action. There are kind of like technical ways to detect those things. But I did some digging myself out of curiosity, and I went to, for example, the Yellow Vest page and found someone had shared an article about legislation in BC that was anti-corruption, so that if someone comes into a windfall of like a large sum of money, for example, and it was unexpected, the government can investigate it. Now, I am not an economist by any stretch of the imagination. There's a lot of nuance to this. But I clicked on the link, and it brought me to a YouTube page where some vlogger person had like a watermark in the bottom right-hand corner that was like pressfortruth.ca, which I don't know if that's a reputable publication. I've never heard of it before. And then he had a guest from alternativemedia.com. And these are the kinds of links that people are sharing. And the commentary around this particular example, just to give a tangible example of this stuff, was the Canadian government, even though this is BC legislation, is going to confiscate your money, because this legislation was in order to identify, for example, corruption. They would place a hold. Now, this got a lot of people up in arms because they're like, oh, government's going to take my money. But it's not about most people. It's about very specific instances. There's a lot of nuance. It's not black and white. So that becomes like a citizen literacy initiative. And I understand that there is the Digital Citizen Initiative that Heritage Canada has a pot of like $7 million of funding. And I'm wondering, has that funding been announced? And what measures are we taking for domestic misinformation, which is sometimes not intentional?
So I think your question speaks on one level to, and Sasha alluded to it in her opening remarks. When we first started digging in to the issue post-2016 U.S. election at PCH, we put motivations for disinformation into three broad categories: foreign state actors, for sure, right? But political motivations, right? And that could be either domestic or foreign, and then economic motivations. And then I think as we further thought about this, you kind of also start thinking about ideological motivations as well, right? And what's interesting, right, and is the sort of complexity in some of these spaces whereby, you may have somebody who's doing something because they just want to make the ad dollars off of it, or maybe, they are an agent of a foreign state. But there's an interaction that sometimes happen with like what, people call true believers sometimes, right? Someone whose worldview kind of reflects, again, that lack of trust in government or whatever, right? And I think, that's a complex sort of, transaction to unpack. And so, I think we need to be very mindful when we act as government that not everybody's a public servant and has kind of faith in the system, right? And so, even in sort of thinking about the $7 million that we're putting out the door, and most decisions are done, but I'm not going to scoop ministers, so it's coming, yeah. Because the intention, again, was to get those activities out the door in the lead up to the federal election. To really think about, right, those credible civil society organizations that have proven track records, right? So that it's not government, right? That we are actually distancing ourselves from some of these campaigns and tools development, so that it's not coming from Canadian heritage where somebody's going to say, well, this is just propaganda, right? At the end of the day, people can make their own decisions about the track record of that civil society organizations, many of which in the Canadian context have operated for many, many years, right? So I think that's a really important piece, and for me, again, speaks to kind of the multi-stakeholder nature of this problem. That can't just be government, right? Platforms got to be involved, civil society's got to be involved. There's a role for government, sure, again, in articulating as Canadian society what are our expectations of action in this space, but there will be really important actors that need to be involved in terms of doing some of the doing, so.
And Owen, I know you've done your memorandum to cabinet, your treasury board submission, your program's getting going. But if people online or in the room are from another department and agency and they want to learn more, how do they connect into your group?
They can write Chris. They can. Well, there's a webpage. So if you go to the Arts and Culture page under Government Canada, you'll see there's kind of a section now, online disinformation, that talks about the Digital Citizen Initiative, how we solicited proposals, how that money's going out the door. So it's there. They can send me an email. I'll put them in touch.
Fantastic. Well, we're at the conclusion of the event, and maybe just ask each of the panelists for a quick last word, if there's anything that they wanted to add, or any organization or any resource that they want to point out to the crowd. But otherwise, just a last word, and maybe Sasha, I'll start with you.
There's somebody that's asked, give me an example of alt-right misinformation that may have affected the European parliamentary elections. I can think of 3, I mean, including the fact that, 200,000 fake accounts in support of AfD were operating all the way through to the elections, which may or may not have had an impact, but nonetheless shouldn't have happened. But just to give you a sense, which I think is important, of the way in which something that starts in the fringes, that we discussed before, ends up in the mainstream. The identitarians have been fond of a concept they call remigration. This builds on the attack on the Global Migration Compact. They, in their alt tech channels, started to talk about a remigration compact, which is essentially ethnic cleansing by, another name. Shocking, kind of very fringe, you'd imagine. Remigration ended up on the billboards of the AfD. There were open discussions by politicians running in the European parliamentary elections about remigration. It was even mentioned by a left-wing politician. We need to have a conversation about remigration. It just goes to show, we can show how, the pathway of these types of fringe and very extreme views from fringe to mainstream. And there's work we're doing with MIT to be able to track the pathway of ideas across the media ecosystem from fringe to mainstream. There's a lot of this happening, a lot more than one imagines. And so that would be one example. And I would just say that's very, very, very frightening. And we need to be alive to the fact that this larger strategy around authoritarian nationalism is taking hold internationally. And there really does, need to be a very concerted effort internationally across different sectors. And so it's a wonderful thing to be invited here. I hope we can all work together to get this right.
Fantastic. Ed, your last word?
Yeah, I'd say, number one, that the democracy of this country, I suppose, the most famous attack on it directly might be the FLQ crisis in 1970, and we had a prime minister named Trudeau who said that he wasn't going to be weak-hearted about it. And I think that's good. I think if we see an election attack, I don't think we should be weak-hearted about it at all. And I think there's a suite of solutions that are required. But at the end of the day, as several of my colleagues here point out, it requires an informed electorate to be informed and be able to make critical judgments, to your question that you ask. And there's structural impediments to that, and we have to think about the structural impediments. I grew up in a world, political philosophy of truth and falsehood would grapple, and who knew truth ever to be the worse for it? John Milton. But if you're in a separate filter bubble, and a separate echo chamber, and you don't have a common platform on which they can grapple, then you've got a problem, and then you have to use policy to try to make sure that we have those common platforms and that they're as clean as possible without getting certainly anywhere close to people's right to express themselves.
Adam?
I'll end on what I think is a positive note. I think that we've got a very resilient citizenry and electorate. I think they're fairly well educated. They could be more so, and I think there's a job there for the government to do. But we haven't even touched on the question of sort of impact. We've been talking about the activity itself. And I think there's probably as many instances of foreign influence activity and this sort of social media activity not having the desired outcome that they want. So it can be a very clumsy, ineffective tool as well if it's not done right, and it often isn't done right. So I think with a little more kind of rigor on the part of government and Canadians and sort of alertness to the issue, we should be able to manage it quite well.
I guess just to riff off that, right? Like I think as the public service, it's our duty to be thorough, and it's not always the intuitive answer, right? Like breaking down echo chambers, for those who follow this space know that, there was a study, I think it came out of the US, you expose to Republicans to more Democrat type content and it just leads further to alienation, right? So the idea that this is just, we need, Republicans to read the New York Times and we need, Democrats to, read Republican type newspapers isn't, not the answers are not always intuitive, and that's again, if you haven't caught, like my pitch is, we really need to lean in and start articulating what some of the crunchy problems are, saying, okay, let's try a tool, try a solution, measure it, see if it works, and if it does, great, scale it up and apply it and share it with partners across the world, so you start getting that sort of critical scale point, and if not, you give up and you try the next one, right?
Well, a great call to action and call to evidence on a really important public policy issue. So I just want to thank you all on behalf of the audience for your contributions. And thanks to you for tuning in and coming in. And we, the North, wish you a great evening.
You're right. I forgot to say.